the UK saw mass protests around this issue, and then the response was a lot of very irresponsible rhetoric from government ministers, from the Prime Minister, labelling essentially the whole protest movement as hate marches, and calling on the police to take more severe action and restrictive action towards the protests. We also saw the government respond legislatively by introducing new amendments. In the UK, we've been seeing a massive restriction of protest space over the last few years, and in response to the more recent protests, again, the government introduced further amendments to ongoing pieces of legislation that would have further restricted protest. They also introduced a new definition of extremism, and were talking about labelling not just Palestinian organisations, but a lot of organisations, particularly those who are taking direct action, onto that list of extremism, and coupling together that with a lot of the recent environmental protests, so that there was a kind of real shift of using what was happening, kind of these mass protests, to delegitimize protest tactics as a whole. So we saw that those kind of that language of hate marches, of no-go areas, particularly for Jewish people, and this real kind of stoking of kind of community division from our politicians. In terms of how this played out on campuses, it's been interesting. We've seen kind of a growing amount of student actions, and a real kind of uptick since the kind of growth in protests in American campuses as well. And initially, actually, the response from universities has been quite balanced, from vice chancellors talking about balancing safety, the right to education, with the right to protest. There was this quite perverse egging on from certain politicians and elements of the press, almost hoping for kind of American style repression of those protests. You had former Home Secretaries going down to the encampments with some right-wing press, trying to kind of engage and get protesters to to talk to them and try and kind of really stoke up this febrile atmosphere. And for the most part, universities have handled that relatively well. Vice chancellors were summoned to meet the Prime Minister, where he demanded that they take zero tolerance toward anti-Semitism and so on. And again, there was resistance for the most part coming from vice chancellors. That was until last week, where the police were called in Oxford University, and 16 people were arrested then. I think it's now 17 on charges of aggravated trespass and also affray. And that marks real kind of escalation to where we're at on this issue, and is really concerning and troubling. But what we've been doing at Liberty is putting out advice information about people's rights, and I'll share a link in our folder in the chat for that. And I just also want to kind of thank particularly the European Legal Support Centre, who gave us a lot of advice on what to put in there, and I'll link to them, and they're definitely worth a follow. The big news in the UK is that we now have a general election, and perhaps in the Q&A I can talk more about what that means for this issue as well. But I'll sum up there, not to kind of go over my allotted time. with the 17 people who've been arrested, they're now out on bail, and we'll wait to see what happens there. Quite often in these situations, the charges end up being dropped, and the arrests are used as a way of breaking up any protest in the moment. But we will wait and see. There are concerns raised over disciplinary actions around being kicked off courses, around not being able to attend graduation, and then particular concerns raised, and I think Arif mentioned this in the Australian context, but from foreign students around their visas, and the impact that taking part in these protests might have on their visas, and that's all stuff that is certainly coming up. I just very quickly wanted to touch on the fact that we're now just over a month away from a general election, and the kind of news cut through around anything that isn't a general election is very low. So even with 17 people being arrested last week, if that had happened just a week before, I think it would have been a much bigger media story. So far, it hasn't become an issue within the general election, but I can absolutely see how these protests should be responded to becoming a dividing line, or an attempted as a kind of stoking a culture war within this election, and we'll see kind of more pronouncements from the different political parties responding to it. The good news about the election being called is that a very particular piece of legislation that was going to ban public institutions from essentially endorsing boycott, divestment, and sanctions didn't have time to pass through into law. So that is good news, that piece of legislation isn't progressing at this point. I think in terms of those kind of responses to the students, we are kind of waiting to see what happens very specifically with those who've been arrested, and have concerns particularly around foreign students in terms of the impacts on their visas.